So in part three, I continue to talk about what was happening at the school before I went to the trip to northern Ghana. I'll talk about that in another podcast. So meanwhile, at school, I tried to assist some of the teachers with some tips on how to improve their skills. I also did a little teaching myself. Always the students responded enthusiastically. Success at school was the clear pathway out of hardship and sometimes even poverty. So their motivation was very strong. They were so enthusiastic. With Bogart's help, I also started a debating club, and soon we were training students for a debate to be organized in front of the bishop and invited guests. Not only was Bogart a skillful teacher, but he was also skillful in handling Agrippa. He was also an excellent organizer. His efforts allowed the bishop the time and freedom to direct the school. Projecting onto the wall of a classroom in the evenings, Bogart helped me organize some movies and some interesting programs which the children loved. Mr. Bean was their favorite. I attended some of the bishop's services in the school on Sundays. Not a churchgoer myself, I was intrigued by the bishop's services. They took place in the school in a covered area. There were many people there on a Sunday. Students, teachers, workers, parents, and people from the community. Maybe about 60 or 70 perhaps in all. The occasion was always colourful and joyful, with everyone dressed in their Sunday best, beautiful Ghanaian smocks, some of them made of kente cloth. The bishop led it and exhorted the assembled to sing and dance for the most part, and only occasionally to listen to him. He told jokes and laughed all the time. The event lasted for between 2.5 to 3 hours, and I was mesmerized, even though it was all mostly in Ewe, the local language, and not in English. People came and went at will from the gathering. There was no insistence on silence or order. There was none of the stultifying formality which characterizes the white man's church in Ireland or Australia. And as far as I could tell, very little of the senseless moralizing and focus on individual behaviour seen from the pulpit in Australia or Ireland. It was a celebration of community life, a true celebration of life in an environment which had not the material riches enjoyed by the citizens of the so-called developed countries. At some point, I had to let Agrippa know what I was thinking. I wrote to her expressing my disappointment at the accommodation on my arrival, and explaining that I did not want to carry out the role of messenger as she had obviously envisaged for me at school. She didn't give up without a fight, though. Knowing that I was disenchanted with her, she asked her husband, my friend from my university days, to call me to try and get me to come on board. Her husband ignored my plight and had already made up his mind to take his wife's side and berated me over the phone for being disloyal, claiming that the bishop and Bogart could not be trusted. Well, after just a few weeks, I felt I was in a better position to judge who was trustworthy. My friendship with Woof Woof, as he was thenceforth named, thus ended there and then. At the end of my 3-month stay at the school, I had organised a trip to northern Ghana to visit my old school, where I had been a volunteer 40 years previously. It was a huge success, and I will talk about it in another podcast. But after that trip to the north of Ghana, I returned again, elated, to the school at Kpando, where I was farewelled royally by the bishop and his wife and Bogart. I had been inspired and spiritually rejuvenated by my trip to Ghana. I was determined to try and raise money in any way that I could when I got back to Australia. Meanwhile, Bogart said he was going to work on a strategic plan for the school, which I could present to various sponsors. I came back from Ghana via Ireland, which is actually not far away from Ghana. It's only 6 hours by plane to London. And I stayed with my friend in Ireland and then talked enthusiastically to him and anyone I met about the project. I was so keen to get started raising funds. In Ireland, I made some inquiries to financial advisors about how I might set up a charity to assist the school with pens, exercise books, textbooks, and a dining area. Basically, the message I heard was that I shouldn't do anything at all till I got back to Australia and registered a charity. On my way back from Ireland to Australia, I visited my old friends in Edinburgh and at Cresswell in England. And I also visited an old friend in Wales who had been a volunteer in Ghana with me in 1976. I thought he just might be interested. This turned out to be the case. When I returned to Australia, my friend Charles soon wrote to me and told me that he was indeed very interested and planned to write to the bishop and visit the school. That was the start of something very special for the school. Charles did indeed visit the school and became enthused like myself. Over the next 4 or 5 years, Charles made many visits to the school and made a huge contribution to its development. As a science teacher, he was instrumental in setting up a very successful electronics program for the students. Charles would bring 3 or 4 suitcases with him of electronics kits, which the children just loved to work with. And for some of this time, Charles was on crutches, but this did not deter him. This program was so successful that he was eventually invited to workshop the program at other schools in the area. Thus, the profile of the school was raised in the community. In addition to the electronics, Charles became involved with the sponsorship of students, and he helped out in many other ways, such as fixing the school bus when it broke down and providing a backup electricity generator for when there were blackouts. In the absence of a wide network of contacts, when I got back to Australia, I first visited several banks, thinking they might know what to do. They all said the same thing: register as a charity before opening a bank account for the charity. They advised me to contact the ATO, the Australian Tax Office, for advice on how to set up the charity so that it would attract tax-free status and/or tax relief for donors. But none of this turned out to be straightforward. The ATO advised that I might need several directors in Australia and documents, such as minutes of meetings, etc., to establish that the charity was not a scam. I was disheartened by all this bureaucracy, as I did not know 5 people who would wish to be directors of a charity. Migrants don't have networks of such people, and local Australians always forget this they have such an advantage because of their networks. So I had to think of other ideas. I searched the internet for similar African fundraising ideas. I found something similar to what I was doing in Adelaide, which raised 10,000 a year selling LED lighting ornaments. I visited them. They said that since I was only looking to raise a small amount of money, that it would not be worth the bureaucracy of setting up a charity, as it might take months or even years. They suggested piggybacking on a smaller charity to obtain the advantage of tax-free donations for donors, in exchange for a percentage of the donations, of course. This sounded okay to me, but the question of how the funds were to be raised was a central issue which occupied my mind. I suggested to the LED Lighting charity that I might do public speaking with community groups, telling them my story in order to raise money. But they said community groups wanted mostly entertainment. And besides, they were often suspicious of requests for money. I would have to convince potential donors who didn't know me that I was not a scammer. They suggested I needed a skill to sell or a product like LED lighting that they had, or something like cooking food. My church contacts, although interested in my personal story, advised me not to approach churches requesting donations. The church, as everybody asking them for money, was their glib message. For me, it was simply a question of what is important, what's valued. I suppose deciding whether someone should be baptized this way or that way is important to some churchgoers, but it was not important to me, and certainly not as important as helping orphans avoid a life of child labor. Discouraged again, I posted a message on Facebook asking for other suggestions about how to raise the funds, but got no response. I wrote a letter to the Australian, the national newspaper, the Adelaide Advertiser, another local newspaper, and an even more local newspaper, offering to write an article free of charge on my experiences in the hope that I might get ideas from an appeal to readers at the end of the article. No response from the mass media. Others suggested I try to twin my school in Ghana with a local school here in Adelaide. I told them I had written to the schools in Adelaide before I left Australia, but none of them had registered the slightest interest. They had not even replied to my letters. Someone suggested I write to the local primary school to suggest a twinning program. I did, but again was disappointed in their lack of interest. They didn't reply to a long and quite well-crafted letter. I joined the Lions Club in Adelaide, again to try and interest them in my project. But when I got round to making my presentations, most of them made their excuses and went home early, saying they had other commitments. Lions clubs were focused on local projects. I joined Toastmasters and Rostrum, both public speaking clubs aimed at the local entrepreneurs in the business community, with the same objective. But they were not interested either. I had one friend in England who was considering setting up a relationship between her school and my school. Maybe we could set up a twinning arrangement where we could exchange ideas. Perhaps some fundraising can come out of such a project eventually. Who knows? Other friends suggested I contact Rotary to speak at dinners to see if I could get donations for speaking at the dinner. I approached several and had a positive response from one who invited me to make a presentation. But the donations were very disappointing at the end of it. Maybe it wasn't a good presentation. I don't know. I thought it was okay. I also contacted the Ghanaian Association here in Adelaide. A Ghanaian is actually the president of one of the Lions clubs here, and he invited me to a club night. I attended the event. I hope to develop this relationship, but unfortunately, he showed little interest in the project in Ghana, but more interested in me becoming a member of his club to be interested in his local projects. There is a certain type of Ghanaian that I have found overseas that is even more cynical about corruption in Africa than white people are. This man was pleasant, but from what he said, I think he was one of them. I also hope to approach some of my former students from Ghana from 40 years ago who are now citizens in their local communities in Ghana. In the north of Ghana, this was. Many of them were now doing very well. I was hopeful they might be able to assist too, but I was never able to raise much money from that. I suppose they were much more interested in their own local areas too. The bishop, Bogart, and myself worked together on a proposal which we hoped to present to larger donor organizations for a capital sum to provide the money for projects such as building classrooms and increasing teacher salaries. I also approached various local charities which worked with refugees. I'd worked with some of them before as a volunteer in Adelaide. Sometimes the obstacles were bureaucratic. Other times it was just the fact that people could not bring themselves to contemplate helping anything other than their own pet project. Again, I was disappointed in the response. Local churches were not interested because I don't think they trusted me or the bishop. They only trusted their own religious types. They wouldn't even invite me to present. I was working on all of these ideas at the same time. But while I was doing this, the bishop and Bogart were toiling away 24/7 in the sun in Kpando under the mango tree. Eventually, I decided that the only way to proceed was to ask my friends for a donation. I wrote a long but rambling begging letter to my friends asking for a donation. They responded very generously and positively, and I was soon able to send a few $1,000s to the bishop. I don't think I was particularly talented at raising funds, but I learned a lot and had some success in the end.